Okay, so in this video, we are going to be looking at forgetting, which is the loss of information from long-term memory. Now, why we can forget something it really depends on different memory failures at different points in the stages of memory processing. So remember, those are encoding, storage, and retrieval. So one reason we forget is because of an encoding failure. This occurs when the memory is never stored in our memory in the first place. So remember, encoding is getting the information into the memory system, and an encoding failure is when that doesn't happen. Successful encoding requires effort and attention. Of course, there are some examples, as we discussed, there are some forms of information that are automatically processed, like time, frequency, meaning of words. But otherwise, most things require effortful processing. They require effort and attention. And if we don't pay enough attention, then that information is not encoded deeply enough. And so we won't remember the information. So as an example, if I ask you to tell me which is the correct stop sign or which is the correct nickel, most of you will probably have a hard time telling me. And that's just because even though we look at these things almost every day, we don't actually encode them on a deep enough level to remember them. We don't really sit there processing what a stop sign or a nickel looks like. So the information is not stored in our memory system for us to retrieve it. If you're curious, this C is the correct nickel. I actually cannot tell you what the correct stop sign is. I can tell you that it's either this one or this one. The difference seems to be the font, and comparing it to an actual stop sign, I cannot tell which one it is, but it's one of these. Now, the other thing to mention, in your book, it talks about the 7 sins of memory, and the first 3 are all forms of forgetting. So one of those is absent-mindedness, and that is a form of encoding failure. So the example your book gives that I like is if you forget where you put your phone because you weren't paying attention in the first place to where you put it. Where you put the phone was never encoded in the first place because of that lack of attention, and as a result, you cannot remember where you put it. So another reason we can forget is due to failure during, Another reason we can forget is due to storage failure. And so this doesn't mean necessarily that the information wasn't stored, but it results from the certain limitations that our storage systems have. So one of the 7 sins listed in your book is transience, and this is an example of storage failure where the accessibility of memory decreases over time. Basically, our memories start to decay. If we don't use the information, then of course we are likely to forget it just because it has decayed over time. So for example, if I ask you to try to remember the very first phone number you ever had, you probably can't, even though you had, there was once upon a time where you knew that off the top of your head. You'll now have a hard time because that memory has decayed. We can then also forget as a result of retrieval failure. So a failure in the process of retrieving the information. So the next of the 7 sins is blocking. And so this is where accessibility of information is temporarily lost. The information is there. It's in your memory system, but you just don't feel like you're able to access that. So the best example of this would be the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And this is something I'm sure you've all experienced. For me, it's usually when I'm trying to remember the name of a movie or an actor, and it's on the tip of your tongue. Usually you know that it begins with a letter, or you just feel like, it's right there. You just cannot remember it. And then the next day or a couple of hours later, your brain's like, here you go. The information was always there, just at that point in time, something was blocking access to that. So failure to retrieve information can also be due to interference, and there are 2 types that we're going to talk about. But again, here the information is there, it's in the memory system, it just cannot be accessed due to interference that is either caused by old memories preventing access to new memories, or new memories preventing access to old memories. So here we've got, first of all, proactive interference, and this is where old information hinders recall of new information. So you've learned your combination to your high school locker, and that memory is so strong that even though you've got this new gym locker, every time you go to put that gym locker in, you keep thinking of your old high school locker combination and cannot remember your new combination. Okay, so that old combination is hindering you from remembering your new combination. Then with retroactive interference, new information hinders the recall of old information. So you learn your sibling's new college email address, and as a result, you cannot remember her old email address. That prevents you from remembering it. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about in relation to forgetting is amnesia. So this is the loss of long-term memory that occurs specifically as the result of disease, physical trauma, or psychological trauma. There are two types that you will need to know on the exam, which are anterograde and retrograde amnesia. So anterograde amnesia is the inability to remember new information after the point of trauma. So this is commonly caused by some kind of brain trauma, usually to the hippocampus, because if you remember back to chapter 3, the hippocampi's job is to consolidate memories. So short-term memories get turned into long-term memories. And again, if you think back to that chapter, we spoke about patient HM, who had his hippocampi removed in order to treat his epilepsy, which was successful, but he could no longer create new memories. Specifically, he couldn't create new explicit memories. There was evidence that he was creating implicit memories. So for example, they taught him some procedural tasks. I don't know exactly what they were teaching him, but they were teaching him these things every day, and he was improving. He couldn't tell you that he'd ever learned what he was doing before. He had no recollection of that, but he did seem to be improving, which suggests that he was forming implicit memories, but he was not forming explicit memories. Anyway, the main point is that he could not create new memories after the trauma, or after the surgery. He still had all of his memories for everything leading up to that, but he couldn't create new memories. Okay. On the exam, you will need to know what type of amnesia he had. So HM had anterograde amnesia. Another example of this that some of you may be more familiar with is if you've ever watched the movie 50 First Dates. It's been a long time since I watched it, and I cannot remember Drew Barrymore's character's name, but I believe she was in a car accident, and as a result, the idea is that her brain was damaged and she had anterograde amnesia. She could remember everything leading up to it, but beyond that, her memories would only last one day. She couldn't create long-term memories beyond one day. So within a 24-hour period, she could remember everything, but the next day she would have forgotten everything. So again, that is an example of anterograde amnesia. The way I remember that type of amnesia is anterograde, begins with an A, and anterograde is when you cannot remember information after the trauma, which also begins with A. Okay. We'll actually be talking about little memory tricks you can use in the next video, but there's one of them, finding ways to connect information. Retrograde amnesia is then loss of memory, either partial or complete, for events that occurred prior to the trauma. So it could be that the person has completely forgotten everything leading up to that moment, or more commonly what you see is partial retrograde amnesia, where usually it might be for a few hours before or maybe a day before that they've lost memories. The way that I remember that one, I think retrograde amnesia is the loss of old memories before the trauma happened.